Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd take a quick look at a new strategy game that recently hit early access on Steam and GOG. Today, I thought we'd talk about Sigma Theory by Mi-Clos and Goblinz Studios. So, what is Sigma Theory? Well, at a glance, it's a turn-based tactical game with a heavy focus on resource management and global strategy. Although it's thematically similar to games like Phantom Doctrine and Invisibles Inc., it focuses much more heavily on elements of personnel management, international diplomacy, and operational oversight. It's an intriguing new take on the espionage genre, thrusting the player into the role of the director of a spy agency, rather than as one of its agents. Sigma Theory takes place in a near-future version of Earth, where society sits on the cusp of the technological singularity. The world is in the grip of a terrifying new Cold War, as every major world power races to develop what they have dubbed the Sigma Theory, technology so powerful that it will essentially transform men into gods. Sigma Theory is very unusual in that it focuses more on being a global simulation game rather than a turn-based tactical one. The campaign begins with the player being assigned as the new director of one of the many Sigma projects that are now active around the world. It's up to them to recruit scientists and direct their country's research efforts, all while simultaneously disrupting similar projects being carried out by rival nations. As the head of their department, the player does not actually handle most of these tasks in person, instead delegating these responsibilities to their underlings. Research is handled by various scientists that they kidnap or otherwise recruit, while field missions are instead carried out by a hand-picked team of mercenaries or secret agents. However, it's important to remember that every agent, diplomat, and scientist will have their own unique specializations and personal preferences. As the project director, it's vital for the player to learn how to get the most out of each of their operatives, while also compensating for their individual weaknesses. Of course, it's also vital to remember that the player is not operating in a vacuum. Each day worth of campaign time, represented by one turn, every other Sigma project in the world will be taking similar actions. Enemy agents will travel all over the world, sometimes crossing paths with the player's own agents in the process. Eventually, as the Cold War nears its end, the player will even find themselves fending off regular attempts to attack or otherwise sabotage their own research efforts. At the beginning of each new campaign, the player will first have to generate their director, choosing basic details such as their name, gender, and country of origin. They'll also get to pick some basic details about the character's spouse, though this particular mechanic seems fairly underdeveloped at the moment. More importantly, the player will then get to select a team of up to 4 field agents, the units which will essentially form the core of the player's strategy. Although their selection of pre-generated agents will initially be very limited, they will steadily unlock more agents over time, giving them a much wider array of options with each new campaign that they play. Each of these recruits is a unique individual with basic attributes and an assortment of traits helping to simulate their skills and personality. There are charming British spies, reclusive hackers, gung-ho shock troopers, and even bloodthirsty criminals. Every recruit serves a potential purpose out in the field, but many of them are also inherently limited by their own personalities or hidden agendas. A prominent businessman, for example, might find it easier to travel freely across international borders or to acquire smuggled weapons while behind enemy lines. However, their prior obligations to their business or other associates may occasionally demand their attention in the middle of a mission. This might end up resulting in a brief but ultimately harmless distraction, or it might force the player to have to compensate for their sudden absence. Regardless of their exact nature, these agents are generally used to carry out the player's dirty work. They can hack into enemy computer systems, wiping out arrest records, stealing research, or otherwise compromising an opponent's security. They can also be used to actively counter enemy operations targeting the player's project, safeguarding both the player's valuable scientists as well as their hard-won research and technology. Most importantly, though, these agents are used to infiltrate enemy countries to actively disrupt their research efforts, recruiting or even kidnapping their Sigma assets. There are only 15 Sigma-level scientists in any given campaign, and it's ultimately up to the player to decide how they want to manage these very limited resources. The player can attempt to research, approach, and actively recruit an enemy scientist, but this takes time and potentially leaves the player's agents exposed. The player could instead simply kidnap an enemy scientist, but a kidnapped scientist never works as efficiently as a properly recruited one, and they're far more likely to become a security risk in the future. In either case, once the player compromises an enemy scientist, they'll then need to extract them before they can be added to the player's research team. This brings the game into a heavily abstracted tactical mode, requiring the player to oversee their agent's attempts to escape enemy territory with their new recruit in tow. These missions are quick and potentially deadly, with that country's alert level determining both the opposition they will face, as well as how far the agent will have to travel to reach their goal. The agent will travel a random amount of distance towards that goal every round, with each round ending with a special event, prompting the player to recommend how their agent should proceed. These events will often involve high-risk, high-reward scenarios, such as potential shortcuts, unattended vehicles, or tactical resources that could help expedite an agent's escape. However, all of these events also pose a risk of further complications, with the individual agent's skills and personality weighing in to help determine their overall chances of success. The player will also have to deal with enemy patrols, representing things like security checkpoints, police roadblocks, or even full-blown tactical kill squads. Combat is abstract and deadly, with the player simply recommending whether to fight or flee, and what level of lethal force to use. The player can also make use of remote recon drones to help avoid these encounters, or they can deploy a tactical drone instead, if they don't mind causing significant collateral damage. Agent personalities can also pose a potential complication, with particularly stubborn agents outright refusing to obey orders that don't fit their preferred style. A pacifist, for example, might balk at an order that they consider to be excessively cruel, while a bloodthirsty character might instead go out of their way to pick unnecessary fights, leaving a trail of chaos and bodies in their wake. In extreme cases, an agent might even surrender of their own volition, or choose to go out in a suicidal blaze of glory. Particularly cowardly or unlucky agents might even end up sacrificing the scientist they're supposed to be transporting in a last-ditch effort to save their own skin. Pass or fail, in the end, it'll be up to the player to help pick up the pieces. Successful missions might still result in things like arrest warrants or elevated alert levels. Failed missions are even more severe, straining diplomatic relations and potentially costing the player one of their valuable agents. If the player's agent is captured, then they'll almost certainly be interrogated or even tortured, which can end up compromising the player's security or future operations. In the worst-case scenario, the opposing country might even end up declaring war, which can quickly torpedo an otherwise promising campaign. Open warfare will cause the doomsday clock to start rapidly advancing with every passing turn, until the player can find some way to stop it. If the doomsday clock ever finishes counting down to midnight, then that's it. The campaign is over. The player's poor decisions have effectively triggered World War III, ultimately resulting in mutually assured destruction. Fortunately, this is where the game's somewhat bare-bones diplomacy system comes in. The player can use this system to set up meetings with rival project directors, negotiating for things like improved relations, prisoner transfers, or even the peaceful trade of valuable Sigma assets. The greater the request, the lower the chance of it being accepted, though the player can hedge their bets by promising various types of compensation in return. The player can further improve their chances by investigating a project director in advance, since every director will have two defining personality traits. A narcissist appreciates being flattered, for example, while a more formal director might instead prefer getting straight to business. If the player is lucky, their agents might even turn up evidence of corruption or criminal behavior, which can provide even greater leverage during particularly difficult or important negotiations. This can sometimes be complicated by the player's other obligations, forcing them to make difficult decisions or to take sides during bitter disputes. Corporations and activist groups will often approach the player requesting specific favors, promising great rewards or dire consequences depending on how the player responds. The player will even have to carefully manage their relationships with their own government and their loving spouse, with the game coming to a premature end if either relationship breaks down completely. Meanwhile, every turn will continue bringing the world a little closer to the technological singularity. Completing a research milestone will unlock powerful new technology, but only for the first nation that manages to reach it. The player can also opt to sell their discovery to the highest corporate bidder for a short-term boost to their domestic approval ratings and the promise of future rewards. Lower-tier technologies will generally provide small bonuses, such as boosting an agent's strength with cybernetic implants, or ensuring their loyalty with hypnotic conditioning. At higher tiers, however, these technologies will quickly upset the balance of power, with things like mind control, shape-shifting, teleportation, and city-devouring swarms of nanites, provoking an ever-escalating series of bonuses and consequences. Any country that falls too far behind will end up shuttering their Sigma projects entirely, leaving their now abandoned assets up for grabs. Agents and scientists will defect or even outright quit in the face of overwhelming threats, and entire governments will collapse as they find themselves targeted by weapons that are impossible to oppose. Ultimately, there are several ways to lose a campaign, but only one way to actually win it: by surviving long enough to complete the Sigma theory itself. Still, win or lose, the player will be graded on their final performance, with any unlocked agents carrying over into their future campaigns. Now, in its current state, Sigma Theory is an awkward but overall enjoyable experience. While the game initially threatens to overwhelm the player with a wide array of options and mechanics, most of them are actually far simpler than they appear at first glance. This is something that serves as both a pro and a con. On the one hand, it makes the game far more intuitive than you might initially suspect, but it also means that a lot of these mechanics do feel a little too shallow and repetitive. Kidnappings and high-stakes diplomacy are exciting at first, but only until you realize you're just pushing the same buttons over and over again. It also leaves a lot of the mechanics feeling a little too abstract and unfinished. For example, the player has no way to check an opponent's current research levels, or to track their agents outside the borders of their own country. This makes it very difficult to develop proper counter strategies, because the player literally has no way of knowing what an opponent is currently trying to accomplish. One of the biggest offenders in this area is the current spouse mechanic, which largely comes off as an arbitrary hurdle. The character's spouse simply pops up from time to time, demanding resources or special treatment while providing nothing in return. If the player decides to simply ignore these requests, then their spouse will slowly turn against them, eventually resulting in security risks or even a premature game over. Still, despite these shortcomings, Sigma Theory does present the player with a very novel and unique experience. It's fascinating to explore the concept of international espionage at a global level, even if the actual execution does feel a little too shallow and repetitive at times. Of course, it is important to remember that Sigma Theory is still in early access, so we're not really seeing a finished product. The developers are still actively working on things like bug fixes and game balance, while also reworking some of the more problematic systems entirely, such as the aforementioned spouse mechanic. They've also announced plans to add significant new content over time, such as new story modes, new field missions, new NPCs to interact with, and new agents to recruit. There are also more tentative plans to add things like mod support and extra difficulty options, to help the player further customize their preferred play experience. Personally, I think I've sunk about 20 hours into Sigma Theory already, and I've mostly enjoyed the experience. While the game is definitely more abstract and simplified than I would like, I think it does offer more than enough content to justify its very modest asking price of just $18 US. Then again, as usual, you don't have to take my word for it. If you think that Sigma Theory looks like the sort of game that you might enjoy, then I strongly encourage you to go check it out for yourself. You can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official Facebook page, the official Twitter feed, or the store pages on Steam or GOG. As always, links are in the description.